My beloved child, your soulmate says, please open this before midnight, because there is something I have been carrying inside me for far too long, and I honestly do not know if I will ever find the courage to say it again. If you are hearing these words right now, imagine that this message arrived at the exact moment when everything became quiet, when the distractions disappeared, and when the one person you have tried so hard not to think about suddenly came rushing back into your mind. They have rehearsed this conversation more times than you could ever imagine. They started it, deleted it, started again, stared at your name, and then convinced themselves that silence would be easier. But tonight feels different. Tonight, they are no longer trying to hide behind pride, distance, or carefully chosen excuses. There is one truth sitting behind every sentence they have never spoken to you, and once they finally say it, there may be no way to return to the version of your story where neither of you knew what the other was feeling. Your soulmate wants you to understand something before anything else. Their silence was never as simple as it looked. There were moments when they wanted to reach out so badly that they almost did it without thinking. There were nights when they opened your conversation, looked at your name, and wondered whether you were still waiting for an explanation. And there was one particular realization that changed the way they looked at everything between you. That realization is the reason this message begins with a request: please keep listening, because the part they are most afraid to admit is not what you expect. For a long time, your soulmate told themselves a story that made walking away feel reasonable. They said maybe the timing was wrong. Maybe too much had happened. Maybe you had moved forward. Maybe you no longer cared. Maybe the connection was something they had imagined because they were afraid to face what it actually meant. They built explanation after explanation, and every explanation gave them another reason not to speak. But then something unexpectedly small happened. A memory surfaced. Maybe it was a song, a familiar place, an old message, a photograph, a phrase you once said without realizing how deeply it would stay with them. And suddenly, everything they had buried came back at once. They remembered the way you made ordinary moments feel different. They remembered the conversations that continued in their mind long after they ended. They remembered the version of themselves that appeared around you. The softer version, the honest version, the version that did not have to pretend everything was under control. And that frightened them, because they discovered something they had been avoiding. They were not simply missing a person. They were missing the possibility of who they could have become beside that person. That is when the question began haunting them: what if I misunderstood everything? What if the person I thought I needed to forget was actually the person I was afraid to lose? Your soulmate may have acted distant, but distance did not erase the connection in their mind. It only gave their thoughts more room to grow. And now they have reached a point where pretending is becoming harder than telling the truth. But there is another layer to this message, and this is where your soulmate's voice becomes quieter. They are not only thinking about what happened between you. They are thinking about what they did not say when they had the chance. They remember moments when you were probably waiting for clarity and they gave you confusion instead. They remember when you needed honesty and they responded with silence. They remember times when they could have explained themselves but chose to protect their own emotions instead. And the hardest realization has been this: they may have made you believe that you were not important to them when, privately, you mattered far more than they were willing to admit. They know you cannot read their thoughts. They know you could only judge them by what they showed you. And now they are beginning to understand how painful that must have been. Their greatest regret is not simply that they stayed quiet. It is that their silence may have told a completely different story than the truth inside them. There is something they wish they could go back and say during one specific moment between you. Something simple, but powerful enough to change the meaning of everything that happened afterward. They wish they had looked directly at you and said, "Please don't mistake my silence for indifference." Because the truth was almost the opposite. The more deeply they felt, the more carefully they tried to control it. They thought controlling their feelings would protect them from disappointment. Instead, it created distance. And now, when they imagine you moving forward without ever knowing what was really happening inside them, they feel a heaviness they cannot easily explain. And here is the confession your soulmate has been approaching this entire time. They are beginning to realize that losing the opportunity to tell you the truth would hurt more than admitting it ever could. They do not know what your response would be. They do not know whether you would believe them. They do not know whether enough time has passed for you to see them differently now. That uncertainty is exactly what has kept them silent. But somewhere inside, they have reached a decision. They would rather be honest once than spend years wondering what might have happened if they had simply spoken. So if their message could reach you tonight, they would not begin by asking you to forgive them, and they would not begin by asking you to come back. They would begin with one sentence. "I need you to know that you were never as easy for me to forget as I made it look." Then they would tell you about the moments they kept private, the memories they never admitted still mattered, and the realization that finally broke through all their excuses. They would tell you that sometimes people create distance not because they feel nothing, but because they feel something they do not yet know how to handle. And perhaps the most surprising part is still ahead, because there is one thing they discovered about your connection that they never expected to understand, and once they reveal what that discovery was, you may finally understand why this message had to reach you before midnight. What your soulmate discovered next was not something they expected to understand so clearly. It happened when they stopped asking, "Why did this happen to me?" and finally asked, "What was I trying so hard not to feel?" That single question opened a door they had kept closed for far too long. Suddenly, memories that once seemed random began connecting like pieces of a story they had misunderstood. They remembered how often they searched for reasons to stay detached, even when their heart was pulling them in the opposite direction. They remembered how your smallest gestures could stay in their thoughts for hours. They remembered the strange way your absence could make ordinary days feel incomplete. And then came the realization that shook them most. They had spent so much time trying to prove that they could live without you that they never stopped to ask whether they actually wanted to. That is the part they cannot easily explain. They do not want you to think this message is simply about missing someone. It is deeper than that. Your soulmate is realizing that what they felt around you changed something inside them. You challenged the version of themselves they had carefully built. You made them question old patterns, old assumptions, and even the emotional walls they thought were protecting them. And now they are looking backward with a completely different perspective. They are asking themselves why they allowed fear of uncertainty to become stronger than their desire for honesty. They are asking why they waited for a perfect moment that never existed. Most importantly, they are asking whether you ever knew that there was so much more happening beneath their silence. Then came the moment they least expected, the moment when they realized that they could no longer blame timing for everything. Timing may have complicated your story, but their choices mattered too. They know there were moments when one honest sentence could have changed everything. They know there were opportunities to explain what they were feeling, but they let those opportunities disappear. And now they are imagining you on the other side of that silence, wondering what you concluded about them. Maybe you thought they did not care. Maybe you thought they had moved on. Maybe you decided that whatever existed between you was only important to you. That possibility has been weighing heavily on them because it means their silence may have caused you to believe something that was never true. Your soulmate wishes they could erase that misunderstanding, but they cannot. They can only tell you what they understand now. And what they understand now is startlingly simple: they were not ready for the emotional honesty your connection demanded from them. They wanted the comfort of feeling close without facing the vulnerability that came with being truly known. They wanted certainty before taking a step, even though relationships do not always offer certainty first. They wanted to know the ending before they were willing to begin the next chapter. And perhaps that is why this message feels so urgent to them. Not because they expect you to instantly change your life for them, but because they finally understand that silence has consequences. Every day they waited was another day in which you had to create your own explanation. Every unanswered question became another piece of distance. Every unsent message became another opportunity lost. And now they are standing emotionally at the edge of a truth they can no longer pretend does not exist. There is one confession they have replayed in their mind again and again, and if they could speak directly to you, they would probably lower their voice before saying it. I was not confused about you. I was confused about myself. That sentence explains more than they ever managed to say before. They were confused about what they deserved, what they were capable of giving, and whether they could handle a connection that felt more meaningful than they had planned for. They may have looked calm while their thoughts were anything but calm. They may have appeared completely unaffected while privately wondering whether you were thinking about them too. And now, after all this time, they are finally recognizing the difference between being emotionally unavailable and being emotionally unaffected. They were not unaffected. They were overwhelmed by what the connection asked them to confront. You represented a kind of honesty they could not fake. Around you, pretending became difficult. And that is why their feelings sometimes came forward and then disappeared again. They were fighting an internal battle between what they genuinely wanted and what felt emotionally safer. But here is what they discovered: safety without honesty can eventually become its own form of loneliness. They could keep everything controlled, predictable, and carefully distant, but they could not control the memories. They could not control the questions. They could not control the feeling that there was something unfinished between you. And when they finally accepted that, one thought became impossible to ignore: what if I let the person who understood me most walk away simply because I was afraid to let them see the real me? That question has followed them into quiet moments, and tonight, it is louder than ever. Now listen closely to the part they have struggled with most, because this is where their entire perspective begins to change. Your soulmate is not only remembering what they lost. They are recognizing what they failed to appreciate while it was still within reach. They are thinking about your patience, your presence, the conversations that seemed ordinary at the time but became precious later. They are realizing that some connections do not announce their importance immediately. Sometimes you understand their value only after life becomes quiet enough for you to notice what is missing. And that is exactly what happened to them. They started noticing the little things. They noticed how certain situations reminded them of you. They noticed how often they mentally formed a sentence and imagined telling you. They noticed that when something meaningful happened, part of them still wondered what you would say about it. That was the discovery that changed everything. Despite all their attempts to move forward emotionally, some part of them was still carrying a conversation with you. They had never truly finished saying what they needed to say. And now they are wondering whether you would even want to hear it. That uncertainty is why the message begins with, "Please open this." They are not demanding your attention. They are asking for one moment of honesty. One moment where you allow their words to exist without immediately deciding what they mean for the future. Because there is still one final truth they have not revealed, the truth about what they now believe your connection was teaching them all along. And once they finally put that realization into words, the confession they have been holding back becomes impossible to misunderstand. There is something your soulmate has finally understood, and it changes the meaning of every quiet moment that came before. They used to believe your connection was supposed to give them answers. Now they realize it was forcing them to ask better questions. Why did they keep thinking about you when they were determined to move forward? Why did certain memories refuse to lose their emotional weight? Why did they repeatedly imagine conversations that never happened? And why, after all this time, does your name still carry a feeling they cannot easily replace with another? They have been sitting with those questions, and the answer has surprised them. They were looking at the connection from the wrong direction. They were asking what you could give them instead of asking what knowing you revealed about themselves. You showed them parts of their heart they had ignored. You made them recognize how deeply they could care, how much honesty matters to them, and how quickly pride can turn a simple conversation into months of silence. That realization has made them look differently at every choice they made. They are not suddenly pretending the past never happened. They are finally understanding it. And that distinction matters. Your soulmate knows that words cannot rewrite yesterday, but words can finally explain it. If they could sit beside you now, they would tell you that their distance was never proof that you were forgettable. In fact, it was often the opposite. The more meaningful the memory became, the harder they found it to decide what to do with it. They thought time would make the feeling disappear naturally. Instead, time gave them enough distance to recognize what they had been refusing to name. Then one memory returned that they had almost forgotten, and this time it affected them differently. It was not necessarily the biggest moment you shared. It may have been something incredibly ordinary, a look, a conversation, a small act of understanding, a moment when you noticed something about them that others overlooked. But suddenly they understood why that moment stayed. It was because they felt seen. Not admired. Not entertained. Not simply wanted. Seen. And that distinction has become enormous to them. Your soulmate realized that there was a version of themselves around you that did not need to perform. They could be imperfect, uncertain, quiet, complicated, and still feel understood. They did not appreciate the rarity of that feeling at the time. Now they do. And this is where their regret becomes more specific. They regret not telling you that those moments mattered. They regret assuming you already knew. They regret believing that feelings become less important if you do not speak about them. Because now they understand that unspoken feelings do not disappear, they become unanswered questions. Your soulmate has been carrying one particular unanswered question for longer than they want to admit. Did you ever know how much you meant to me? That question is at the center of everything they want to say. They wonder whether you walked away believing you were not enough, when in reality they were struggling to believe they were enough for the depth of connection they felt. They wonder whether you interpreted their hesitation as rejection when it was actually uncertainty within themselves. And they wish they had understood sooner that protecting themselves from emotional risk also meant risking something incredibly valuable. But tonight, something has shifted inside them. They are no longer looking at the possibility of speaking as something that needs to guarantee an outcome. They are beginning to understand that honesty has value even when you cannot control what happens afterward. That is why the words they have been rehearsing sound different now. They are not saying, "Come back because I cannot live without you." They are saying, "I should have told you the truth while you were still close enough to hear it." They want to admit that they noticed your absence. They want to admit that they sometimes wondered whether you were waiting for them to make the first move. They want to admit that there were moments when they almost reached out, then stopped because they convinced themselves that too much time had passed. They want to admit that pride sometimes disguised itself as patience. They called it waiting for the right moment, but underneath that excuse was a fear of hearing an answer they could not control. And then they realized something painful: there may never be a perfect moment. There is only the moment when someone decides that truth is more important than protecting their image. That is the decision your soulmate is approaching now. They have spent enough time wondering what you might say. They have spent enough time imagining every possible response. And finally, they are asking a completely different question: what will I regret more? The possibility that they may not feel the same, or the certainty that I never told them what was real for me? That question has become impossible for them to escape. And their answer is bringing them closer to the confession they once thought they would take to the grave of their memories. Now imagine your soulmate finally dropping every carefully constructed explanation and speaking without trying to sound strong. They would probably tell you that they missed you in ways they never knew how to describe. Not only during lonely nights, but during ordinary moments when something happened and their first instinct was to tell you. They would tell you that sometimes they typed words they never sent. Sometimes they opened old conversations simply because seeing your name made the past feel close for a few seconds. Sometimes they wondered whether you were happier without them, and instead of giving themselves permission to find out, they chose silence. But beneath all of those memories is one realization that has become impossible to ignore: they do not want their final truth about you to be a sentence they only ever said inside their own mind. They want you to know that the connection mattered. They want you to know that they noticed more than they ever admitted. They want you to know that the person you thought had forgotten may have been remembering far more than you realized. And yet, there is still one thing they have not told you. It is not about the past. It is about the future they once secretly imagined when they thought nobody would ever know. That private picture stayed hidden because admitting it would have meant admitting just how seriously they took you. And now they are finally ready to reveal what that picture looked like: and why the thought of it still makes their heart pause whenever your memory returns.